Welcome to the Fantasy Footballers DFS Podcast with your hosts, Kyle Borganoni and Matthew Betz.
Welcome in, guys. It's summertime, and you know what summertime means? Summertime means the best ball sweats with your boys, Borg and Betz. Betz.
Oh,
I know you came up with that, man. So how are you doing, dude?
Gosh, it was a good day, man. You know, anytime you come up with a hashtag or a line like that, you know that the rest of the day just doesn't even matter. That's just the most productive part of your day. And yeah, dude, I'm excited to talk best ball all summer long here, and obviously refine our strategy a little bit. Win some money along the way, maybe take home the Underdog $1 million up for first place in the Best Ball Mania. But yeah, man, that's going to be a ton of fun this summer, just talking best ball and the strategy behind it, how to win consistently, and like I said, how to get filthy rich playing best ball.
Betz, I didn't know that you were such a marketing genius. You were the master behind hashtag cheaper than Netflix. And then you came up with one today, hashtag summertime best ball sweats with Borg and Betz. I know that's a little bit longer, but dude, cheaper than Netflix. That thing's going off.
I think that trended on Netflix on Twitter for approximately 4 seconds the other day. So that was fun. Yeah, dude, you know, I feel like I'm kind of a jack of all trades. You know, I'm talking injuries, talking DFS, talking best ball, marketing. I don't know about you, man, but I think it's time for a raise here with the team.
Dude, you're like a month in, and I think this is the time to put in the raise. But speaking of Netflix, I mean, I know this is off topic, but is there any show that you and Monica are like really into right now, just for the people if they need to get on board?
Oh, that's a good question. We're not really into it per se, but we've been watching it. It tells you where we're at.
We hate it. We hate the show.
Have you heard of the show? It's called Who Killed Sarah? It is a like thriller, obviously, as the name implies, murder, sort of like investigations with a lot of twists and turns kind of things. So we're into that. If you're into those kind of like things that make you like think about what's happening next sort of shows, that's a good one. I will say the acting is, as the kids say, not great. However, the plot line and kind of the storyline behind it is pretty good. But yeah, we've been watching that one. How about you?
So I'm a curmudgeon when it comes to TV. I will not commit to a show. In fact, there are many shows that I wrote off after the first season, including Parks and Rec, which first season's rough. It's rough.
Dude, come on.
And then I've watched it through twice, and I love it.
Okay.
I love the show. Okay. But I'm hard to please. So there's a lot of shows that I think are actually pretty good that I've kind of put off for a while. So we're actually, we've probably watched a lot of main shows, but we're into New Girl right now. I never watched it. And
fantastic.
Schmidt just gets me. So I do like some New Girl. I think it's creative. You know, some of the plot lines are actually kind of predictable, but yeah, I think I'm at season 3. So right now, Jess is not at the point where she and Nick are together. So it's a good point, the show. But yes, we are cheaper than Netflix, Betz, and you did the math for that. And why is that so important for the people to understand? We are cheaper than Netflix when it comes to the Ultimate Draft Kit Plus.
Well, my friend, it is officially, as of the time this show is out, the Ultimate Draft Kit, the UDK is out. It is active. It is live. Get up in there, as is the Dynasty Pass. That's been active for a while. But if you are with us all summer long, if you're with us through the football season, which hopefully if you're listening to the show, you are, and if you're with us through the playoffs, you are going all the way through the first week of February for a low monthly price of about $7. It was $6.25 if you ordered it before June 1st and you missed it, but it's still about $7 to go all the way through the Super Bowl. And we don't even charge you monthly. Like, it's a one-time fee and you're done. And you get to play DFS with us, get our DraftKings picks, our FanDuel picks, our GPP plays, Kyle's wide receiver cornerback matchups, et cetera, et cetera. So much content for such a little price. Cheaper than Netflix, dude.
You're listening to this show. It's June 4th, which means you've gotten into June, but our best ball rankings are actually live, and they're part of the Ultimate Draft Kit Plus. So if you got that, if you pre-ordered it, it's live right now as of June 1st. But as you're listening to this podcast, our Ultimate Draft Kit, our best ball rankings are in there. You can sort through Betz and I and see some of our discrepancies, see where we are ahead of ADP. That's where we talked about last week, some players that we really like. Today, we're going to talk about some best ball strategy. And I believe this episode is something that you can listen to in June. You know what? Listen to it in July. Listen to August. Like, you could keep listening to this episode because we think the tips that we're going to give are helpful in terms of constructing a roster, in terms of thinking differently. But before we get into the strategy bets, which I know you love, I wanted to give you a chance to give any, I don't know, just nuggets, anything from the Ultimate Draft Kit Plus that you've dove into. As of this recording, we're only a couple days into the Ultimate Draft Kit Plus, but for you, just digging around, what has been helpful for you as a tool?
Yeah, there's this section in here under the analysis tab. It's called the injury report. And I don't know who wrote it, but it's freaking awesome, dude. It is awesome. Like, the analysis that's in there is top notch. No, I'm just kidding. I wrote that. No, I do love in the Ultimate Draft Kit, for me, it has got to be the red zone report. Because what do we care about in DFS? What do we care about in Best Ball? We care about ceiling. You cannot get to a ceiling in fantasy without scoring touchdowns. It is so crucial to know who is getting the carries from inside the 10-yard line, inside the 20, who's getting targeted when you get inside the 10-yard line. That is how these players reach ceiling. And Kyle, we're going to talk about it. That's all that matters in Best Ball. So for me, I'm using that as a tool in Best Ball, and I used that quite a bit last year, looking at, just in redraft leagues, who should have performed higher or better than expectation, who fell short, who was getting the opportunities but not scoring. How can you find regression that way? So to me, the red zone report is clutch. I use it both in the offseason and in season 2. It's awesome.
For sure. There's a lot of different tools within the Ultimate Draft Kit and Ultimate Draft Kit Plus. I'll highlight the consistency tools because for me, end of season rankings is kind of what we talk about a lot when it comes to fantasy. Like, we look at certain players and say, oh, he finished as a wide receiver 2 or whatever. I really care about how did they finish the year, or were there stretches where this person was actually good? So if you look in our consistency tools, you can see players like, I don't know, my boy Curtis Samuel from week 10 on, Betz. That guy was awesome. Like, he had as many wide receiver 1 weeks as Stephon Diggs from the second half of the season. Like, and he's being treated just so differently in terms of best ball, especially with Washington. We talked about it today, actually, on the Fantasy Football Show. He's younger than Terry McLaurin, your boy. So I think Curtis Samuel is still being disrespected. He was one of my favorite players in best ball last year. So I love the consistency tool. But Betz, you mentioned it, dude. The blurbs, man. That's what the ladies come for, right? They come for the blurbs.
I think so. I'm pretty sure, yeah, man. Write-ups on, I don't even know how many players, like 200 or something, like ridiculous, 220. The blurbs are just brilliant. And whoever wrote up the one for Jimmy Graham deserves at least a 10% raise in salary. I mean, it is just a thing of beauty.
I mean, there's a lot of things we can give out for free. I will give out this one blurb for free, Betz. I mean, because the people want it. They want to know.
They need it. If they don't want it, they need it.
Just peek behind the curtain, guys. When it comes to writing blurbs, Betz and I were a lot of the ones that did it for positionals. He did it for injury. And when it came to the tight ends, when you start getting to tight end 30, you start going a little crazy, Betz. I mean, that's a wild group of guys that you don't really think about that much. So here is our boy Jimmy Grandpa. I'll read out his blurb. And if this tantalizes you, maybe this is the reason you need to buy the Ultimate Draft Kit Plus. I did have someone on Twitter that reached out to me after they read Sam Darnold's blurb, Betz. They said, all right, I got to buy this. So I figured this is a good marketing technique. So
yes,
just imagine with me, if you're listening, whatever you're doing, Betz, imagine you are a prospective consumer. You are just thinking, wow, I would like to buy the Ultimate Draft Kit. Would this change your mind? So listen up. Despite finishing as the tight end 11 last year, it's still a mystery how Jimmy Grandpa and his body are still allowed in the NFL. Out of everything we survived in 2020, did you have Jimmy Graham catching as many touchdowns as Michael Thomas, Julio Jones, Odell Beckham Jr., and Kenny Golladay combined on your 2020 bingo card? I didn't. With Cole Kmet asserting himself as the lead tight end by the end of the year, the less visually appealing Jimmy G is now relegated to annoying red zone work. You won't be able to start him for fantasy in 2021, which will likely be his final year in the league at age 78. Oops, I mean age 35.
Bravo, my friend. Bravo. That thing is a piece of art, as the kids say these days. I mean, it's brilliant. watch Jimmy Graham come out and like somehow catch like 9 touchdowns again this year and just shove it in your face.
I love elevating players because this is a tough sport. It's physically imposing. Like, I'm never trying to dunk on a player. I will always dunk on Jimmy Graham. As many chances as I get. This guy's 34, 35, whatever. I'm going to dunk on this guy as much as I can. So if you want more blurbs like that, if you want Betts' analysis of injuries, if you want our award-winning rankings from the Andy, Mike, and Jason, you can get that with the Ultimate Draft Kit Plus. It's now $60, but that's a one-time fee. And I think that's pretty crazy considering there's so many sites out there that are great, but they're subscription-based. So this is a one-time fee. You get the DFS Pass. And Betts and I would say that, this is something where, you can pay for it really quickly, especially at the beginning of the year. So check that out at ultimatedraftkit.com. But this episode and the rest of the month is going to be devoted to Best Ball. So Betts, let's talk about some Best Ball.
Best Ball Bonanza.
Yes, Betts. We are talking about Best Ball. And I wanted to get people in the right mindset first. So I actually grabbed some quotes. And I want to set the stage, Betts, of how to play Best Ball. If this is your first time, if you're kind of unfamiliar with the format, or maybe you're someone that's played for a while and you need to just kind of like remind yourself what this is about. I'm going to give you a couple of quotes, Betts, to get you started, to kind of prime your pump.
Hit me.
And the first one we mentioned actually last week, and it's Ricky Bobby. And Ricky Bobby always says, if you ain't first, what?
You're last.
And that's how Best Ball works, right? Or who could forget Highlander, that there can only be one? Or
also true.
How could you not forget the great Michael Scott? I looked at so many Michael Scott quotes today. I wanted to put them all in here, but you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Wayne Gretzky, aka Michael Scott. So explain to the people what we mean by these awesome quotes in terms of how Best Ball works.
I would have absolutely died if you put a Michael Scott quote in for each one of these categories, because I think it could fit everywhere with that show and the ridiculous character. But when we are referencing these silly quotes, they actually matter in terms of Best Ball. Talking about winning, and if you're not first, you're last. It's so true. We talk about this all the time on the show. Basically, here's the idea. In season-long leagues or redraft leagues, you just need to get into the playoffs. Obviously, it's great to have the first seed or the second seed. You get that bye week, but you just need to get into the dance, and then anything can happen from there. In Best Ball, there is no dance. Like, you have to finish in the top of the league for anything to matter in terms of winning the league. You can't come in third. It doesn't matter. Some structures, they'll pay out like you get your money back or whatever, but like to actually be profitable in this, you have to win. Nothing else matters. So if you ain't first, you're last. That's the reality with that one. And then going to Michael Scott, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, aka Wayne Gretzky, aka Michael Scott. You have to be risky in these. Again, we're talking more like tournament strategy, and we'll differentiate the two on the show. But in like a tournament setting, you have to be risky to actually go for the win, as we said in the first quote. So I think they go perfectly together. But yeah, really in season long, it's so different. You care about more of elevating your floor to just get into the playoffs. In Best Ball, I would rather be dead last than third place, because you know that you kind of took a chance and went for it, versus being like, well, I got fourth. Like, that was a pretty good year. No, it was not. You were just as good as 12th.
I think we need to get used to certain terminology in Best Ball. And one of those is, what is a player's high-end range of outcomes? So a lot of times, and it's almost like a joke now in the fantasy industry, like, this guy's a Best Ball guy. We're not just saying players that can have spike weeks. We're looking at players and evaluating them and saying, okay, I might be drafting this wide receiver as the wide receiver 30, but could he be a wide receiver 1 this year? Like that's kind of the best part of this, season of fantasy bets, is like looking at players and seeing the range of outcomes. And so can you find a player in these later rounds? Like last year, it was like Justin Jefferson. You found a player in the 13th round of Best Ball bets that ended up as the wide receiver 6. I didn't see that in his range of outcomes, but I think we should have understood that each player has a range. And if we can explore that, then I think it helps us kind of see, like, how can I have a team that can have a ceiling? And floor is super important. Don't get me wrong. Like, don't look at a team and just say, I only need Deshaun Jackson. Like, that's the only kind of player I need. But I don't know, ceiling means everything.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect way to put it. It's so tricky because like in season long leagues, you can replace these guys if things don't work out. And like, if you have a guy that you're like, all right, I'm gonna take this guy in round 4 weeks in, you're like, it doesn't look like the way I thought it was going to look a month ago. You drop him and you move on. In best ball, if you only go with those like high upside players, again, you could, in theory, hit the nuts and, go for first. Ricky Bobby would approve. Or you could just totally like flame out and have 0 points. But when we're talking about best ball, like it's such a unique strategy and unique format because essentially every week matters the exact same as the week before and after it. It's a cumulative score throughout the course of time of the full season that adds up, and that's kind of your total score. That's how you win the league. So you can't be like waiting for rookies to come around, in the second half of the season. If your entire team is like that, for example, you're going to take zeros essentially for the first few weeks of the season. So you have to have a really balanced roster, in my opinion, that also builds in a lot of upside and ceiling, but still has a few floor plays built in to help get you to the finish line.
And that kind of leads into our next point, just in terms of gaining a best ball mindset. It's that the waiver wire bets is not your friend. Like usually in redraft leagues, you can find the rookie wide receiver, or you can find the backup running back, or you can stream the quarterback on the top. Like there's so many different options at really at all 4 major positions that you can figure out. But streaming is no longer a term you can use in best ball. And backup running backs are actually a gamble because for every, player that you find, like, the classic example is D'Angelo Williams. Like you're finding players like Alexander Madison who did not help you at all last year, even though he was the backup to Dalvin Cook. Like it's kind of a gamble. So my question for you, knowing that there's no waiver wire, how does this change the way we play in terms of our mindset?
Yeah, I think there's just like this extra security built into redraft leagues that, like I was saying, like if it doesn't work out, you just drop them and you move on. Obviously, in this sort of format, that doesn't exist. There's no replacement of your players. You draft the team and you just forget about it. And then you can look back, 4 weeks in, 8 weeks in, at the end of the season. There's no management, which is really nice. But when you look at the inability to replenish your roster from injury and things like that, you have to build in risk in terms of your roster. So essentially, you're kind of baking in like different ranges of outcomes. For example, I think the biggest way to talk about that is like the running back position. You mentioned backups being a gamble. You want to kind of like correlate things, especially in more big tournaments. Like, okay, Ezekiel Elliott, he's obviously a stud. If he has a great season, Tony Pollard does nothing, right? But if you don't get Zeke and you have a couple other stud running backs and great wide receivers, all of a sudden Tony Pollard's sitting there around 9, 10, 11, 12. Well, if you didn't get Zeke, don't think, okay, I can't take the Dallas running back because I don't have Zeke's backup. You actually want him because in things that go sideways and let's say Zeke is injured or something, all of a sudden you have a top 20 back, top 15 back, like 8 rounds behind where he should be going. So you sort of want to kind of build in your quote waiver wire that way and think about upside in terms of ways that you can get different in different scenarios based off of early round ADP players.
Yeah, the only kind of players that I'd ever think about like double rostering the backfield is like a San Francisco situation where like year in, year out, they're like top 5 guys and there's like 2 or 3 of them. But yeah, I think you're right. I want AJ Dillon. I don't want Aaron Jones on the same roster. Like I'd rather pick one or the other. And we talked about that a little bit last week. I also think rookie wide receivers are interesting because we've seen them adjust. I mean, last year might have been an outlier where we see Justin Jefferson, T. Higgins, like these other guys that went super late last year in drafts because there was a presumed wide receiver 1 in front of them and they ended up being the main guy there. So I would just say in terms of the waiver wire not being something accessible, ask yourself the question, who are the players that we can see gain value in a redraft league in the second half of the year? So last year, like those guys were J.K. Dobbins, DeAndre Swift, like those were like league winners in the second half. And so they went a little bit later. So you really have to tell yourself a story. Like they might be in a committee, but like what if they end up being the guy at the end of the year? And that's how you kind of look a little bit differently. But let's go through one more kind of mindset, just understanding that we need bets. And I'm going to give you one more quote. Okay. Is that okay?
I would love that.
All right. This comes from the great Dolly Parton.
The GOAT.
The GOAT of best ball, Dolly Parton. She once said, If you don't like the road you're walking, start paving another one. Betz, why did I pick that quote out?
Because you are crazy. No, the the reason is, and the guys say this on the main show all the time, is like stay water in your draft, right? Like you can't go in with a set spreadsheet and be like, these are the picks, this is how it's going to go. This is easy. I'm just going to do this. Things change all the time. So let's say, for example, in Best Ball, and we'll talk about these strategies obviously over the course of the show and over the course of time, like throughout summer. Like, let's say you want to go into a strategy and you're like, I am taking running backs early no matter what. And all of a sudden, you get to round 2, you have a running back in round 1, you're like, I'm going RB, don't even think twice about it. Tyreek Hill's sitting there in the middle of the second round. Are you really going to pass on Tyreek Hill in the middle of the second round just because you went in with a strategy? No, that would be silly. So I think being able to kind of adapt and like just let the board fall and then kind of build a strategy like in the first probably 3 to 4 rounds makes sense. Like you should probably know at that point, okay, this is an RB heavy build. This is a wide receiver heavy build early. I'm going to go RB late, etc., whatever it may be. But I think just being able to like let the first 2 or 3 rounds play out and then kind of go from there, take value and take, what your board is telling you, or maybe what our rankings are telling you in the DFS pass, like that sort of thing. That's the way that I would do it. Do not go in with a hard and fast rule because it is going to go sideways relatively quick because other people drafting, they don't care what you plan to do. They also have a plan of their own. So I would say, as the guys say, stay water.
Your picks are going to get sniped. And one of the worst things in redraft in any league is the reaction of like, oh, I thought I was going to get this guy. Like, understand that other people like the same players. You're not the only person that likes someone. It's the same thing on Twitter. If you see somebody else hyping up a guy, there's probably 30 other people that like the same player. It's totally okay. It's totally fine. Mike Beers, if you don't follow him, he's basically the best ball guru at Beers Water on Twitter. The best way he could explain it is you shouldn't go into a best ball draft with a plan. You should go in with 20 plus plans because the way that the best ball draft works, it's kind of like a tree and you kind of have to make a decision as you go. Like, okay, I thought I was going to go early tight end, but Kelsey, Kittle, and Waller off the board. So I can't do that. So in other words, do I like the value of, let's say, Hawkinson or Pitts or Andrews, or am I at the point in the 3rd, 4th round where I just need to take these wide receivers and figure out tight end later? And that's just kind of the thing. Like you can actually draw that out on a sheet of paper, and we'll go through some strategies and roster construction plans in a second. But we need to be able to understand that things will change, and don't go in saying, I'm taking 3 quarterbacks no matter what. Like there might be value on Kyler Murray where you say to yourself, I'm taking 2 quarterbacks. I have Kyler Murray in the 5th round, and I'm taking somebody a little bit later, like a Baker Mayfield, and that's fine. Like I'm fine with that. So any last thoughts, Betz, on general strategy?
No, I think that sounds good. I think, are we going to talk on the show? I haven't scrolled down to the doc far enough. Are we going to talk about general strategy for like, okay, this is what I would do for, here's your options for quarterback, here's your options for running back, here's your option for wide receiver builds?
Yes.
Because that I think is really important. Okay, we'll get into it soon.
Yeah, and the last thing I just want to explain is we have some articles on the website about tips and strategies for beginners. We have some ways to strategize and pivot. So if you just search for Best Ball on the Fantasy Footballers website, but we're talking specifically about 12-man leagues and 18-player rosters. So Betz and I play a lot on Underdog, DraftKings. I'm actually in the middle of a draft right now for DraftKings, and Sleeper just came out with a format. So these are 18 rounds that we're talking about here. A lot of them are 3 wide receivers, 2 running backs, a tight end, quarterback, and a flex, and no defense or kicker. So we're really talking about building out a draft that has 18 slots, and every single one of those counts. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but the 18th round matters, and it matters just as much as the first round in terms of end of the season projections. But yeah, Betz, let's get into that. I wanted to give 4 quick points before we get into a little game here. I wanted to talk about roster construction because I think that is, if there's a point that we needed to stay on for a little bit, it's what if I have 7 running backs? Did I do it wrong, Betz? Or what if I have 3 tight ends? How does that change? So Betz, in terms of what you've been doing in Best Ball, what is kind of the range? Because running backs and wide receivers are obviously the position you need the most of. So give me some builds that you've been having in terms of 18 rounds and how you've been constructing yours.
Yeah, for sure. Let's start with the quarterback position because I feel like in fantasy, that's just what everyone talks about first. It's always the quarterbacks. You basically want to have at least 2, no more than 3. There's been a lot of studies done and kind of looking at win rates in terms of, do you take 1, do you take 4? Well, those are both bad ideas because if you just take 1, again, there's no waiver wire. You're taking a 0 whenever that player's in their bye week, and there's not enough, variability and upside. Like you want the computer to just put in your best roster or lineup every single week. If you only have one option, you're limiting your upside. So you definitely want 2 quarterbacks at a minimum. But if you take 4, quarterback scoring isn't variable enough that it like elevates you enough beyond what it matters, and you're just wasting a roster spot essentially. Whether you get 19 points from a quarterback or 15.5 or 16.5, like it doesn't elevate you enough to like help you win. So you're basically burning a roster spot if you take 4. So it's 2 or 3. The way I've been approaching quarterback this year is that I'm trying to find a stud in the first, let's say like top 6, 7, 8 of rankings. So there's a big, I think, group of 4 or 5 guys that you could say like I'm happy with any one of these guys. Mahomes, Murray, Lamar, Dak, etc. Like the guys that have such a massive ceiling. And then there's kind of a middle tier of guys that you're like, yeah, they're good. I like those guys. I want them. But then there's like just everyone else that you like forget about, right? I want someone in that first tier. Like I am not leaving my drafts for the most part without someone that I can say, you know what? I think, let's say in a 17 game season, I think at least like 12 of the weeks, this guy is going to be my best scoring quarterback because they're just so good and they elevate above the rest of the field. You need that ceiling in best ball to help get you there. So I found myself going with 2 quarterback builds. And if I take one of those guys that have such a massive ceiling, I'm sacrificing volume by only taking 2 because I know, like I said, that quarterback I spent a lot of draft capital on is going to be my scorer most of the week. So for me, I find myself going with one of those top echelon guys, and then later in the draft, and I mean later, like round 12, 13, 14, 15, like taking someone else that's just there enough to kind of like help get me along. Because again, we're going for first. Like you want to just have a lot of ceiling built in. And when I'm going for first, I want my second quarterback, this is key, my second quarterback to have rushing upside. I do not want someone that's going to stand in the pocket and deliver the ball downfield. I don't want Derek Carr as my second quarterback because he's fine, he's good, he's whatever. But like I want the guy that's going to break the mold. I want Lamar Jackson from a couple years ago. I want Trey Lance this year. I want someone like that can just go out and break the slate for you or go out and break the tournament for you and really help get you there. So for me, it's a 1 elite guy and a rushing quarterback late. That's how I've been building. What about you?
I think the rushing production is key. Like that's what's essential. So there's a lot of late round guys this year, Trey Lance, Justin Fields, that are super interesting in terms of rookie quarterbacks. You can go a little bit later. I'm actually a fan of Daniel Jones in terms of if he's my second or third quarterback. I think it's totally fine because he can have a couple spike weeks. So yeah, rushing production is kind of key. Last year, if you looked at win rates, which we'll define and kind of clarify what that means a little bit later, but 7 of the 13 quarterbacks that had the most rushing yards finished in the top 12 win rate. So you found guys that were actually winning you best ball based on did they run the ball. And so I think that's super important with quarterback. And yeah, I agree. If I did go with 3 quarterbacks bets, I think it's where I do get someone in the middle tier. It's a Tom Brady, and then I get somebody a little bit later and pair him, Tom Brady, with like a Tua, and I don't know, let's just use Daniel Jones. Like that's 3 quarterbacks. I know it's not the sexiest, trio, but I think it's actually set up where there's correlation. There's some upside, like Tua could definitely outperform his ADP. Daniel Jones could definitely outperform. And so that's where you go 3 quarterbacks. But running backs is kind of tricky because in redraft, we think I'm going to draft a running back in the first round. That's how it's just going to work. But what happens if you miss out on those elite running backs bets? Like, do you pivot? How would you then change?
You definitely want to pivot. And this is kind of where I think this is probably the biggest take home of the podcast in terms of like roster construction.
Not the Dolly Parton quote.
Well, okay, sorry. Second most important part. Sorry, third after the Wayne Gretzky / Michael Scott quote. You basically need to have this locked into your drafts to be successful long term. There are so many people in best ball right now that I see in my drafts reaching for running backs in rounds 3, 4, 5, and 6 because they missed out on the elite guys in the first 2 rounds. And a lot of the data shows that basically there is a significant drop off in running back production in terms of top 24 performances weekly in guys that are taken after like the 4th round. So essentially, as the ADP climbs 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th round, the production and like the usability of these running backs just falls off a cliff. So you're essentially looking for like the outliers that actually perform in that range, and they're just so rare that you're wasting so much draft capital on. You could be getting wide receiver 2s, wide receiver 3s in that range, maybe an upside tight end, etc. You're just wasting roster spots. So literally, I have rules set in for myself. Again, don't go into with one single rule or setting, but if I don't leave the first couple rounds with at least one elite running back, I'm basically saying, you know what, for this draft, I'm embracing it. I'm not going to reach. I'm going to go ahead and take these massive upgrades at wide receiver, and you'll have great options there, obviously, if you don't take running back. But at that point, you just need to kind of be thinking about, okay, who in the later rounds, like round 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, do they have paths to fantasy relevance? Is there someone in front of them on the depth chart? If that they get injured, they are an immediate rock-solid stud. Tony Pollard, Alexander Madison, etc. Or guys that have paths to usability, but they may not need an injury. AJ Dillon, for example. I'm trying to think of someone else. Kenyon Drake, right, in Las Vegas. He'll have a role. Like players like that. So it sounds gross. It sounds really scary, but you don't want to just fall into the trap of being like, well, everyone else took a running back, so I have to too, and I'll take one ahead of ADP, because it turns out that reaching has shown to be a negative predictor of success in best ball.
In redraft, if you're used to redraft leagues, you understand that the middle round running backs are rough. I wrote up an article earlier this offseason, but rounds 3 through 7, in terms of win rates for best ball, are rough. And it's actually where we saw a spike last year in wide receiver win rates. Like rounds 3, 4, 5, 6, and like those were the positions where if you did go wide receiver there, then you got Calvin Ridley, you got DK Metcalf. Like you got some players last year that really were difference makers, and they outperformed their ADP. So I agree with you, Betz. Get a stud in the first round. Like if you can, that's what you need to do. That's priority number 1. If you can, do not reach on a player that you think doesn't have the safety and that can't be your rock, and go a different route. So for me, for running backs, it's early and few. So maybe 4 or 5. And if it's late, it's 5 or 6. And I think 6 is kind of pushing it, if I'm honest. Hopefully you have somebody in your mix that you can count on as an RB1. But 5 is probably preferred in terms of the most, 4 or 5 running backs, because Betz, wide receivers, honestly, are what win best ball. And there's so many wide receivers. I just need to say that off the top. Like it's called the wide receivers for a reason, because Betz, the wide receivers ranked from wide receiver 30 to wide receiver, 60 are basically like 30 points difference. Like there's not that much between those guys. So in terms of wide receivers, how many are we talking for roster construction?
Yeah, this kind of goes right in line with what you're saying for the running backs. If you are taking, let's say, 4 running backs, 5 running backs, you're basically looking at a scenario where you need, like, I would say at minimum 7, but ideally up to like 8 or 9. You're basically saying, okay, if I go running back early, let's say I leave my first round with, Austin Eckler and Joe Mixon in the first 2 rounds. You're looking at saying, okay, like the running backs we know in rounds 3, 4, 5, and 6 don't have a high hit rate. So I'm just going to pass on those guys. I'm going to take a lot of wide receivers here, and I'm going to go volume at wide receiver. And when you go volume at wide receiver, you just know that you have way more shots at high spike weeks than you do at the running back position. We just don't see a lot of spike weeks from random running backs. Like in DFS, if you hear us on the show, we're not like, oh, here's your sleeper running back for the week. It's so predictable, and the ADP follows it. So you're almost wasting your time trying to find like the diamond in the rough. Whereas wide receivers, you don't have to be so selective and like, oh, I'm so in on this guy, but I'm out on that guy. Well, if you take a lot of like wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, 3 caliber players, and Kyle just said they're so like expansive. Who can actually finish there? The range of outcomes is massive. And you want to just have every single week, I've got 8 or 9 guys that I know can have a spike week for 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. You don't have that at running back. So you just need to build more volume to kind of compensate for maybe the lack of perceived quote unquote quality at wide receiver. So if you're going running back early, get a ton of wide receivers, go 8, go 9 to really round out your roster. You're going to be really happy, I think, with the overall like up and down nature of the wide receiver. They're hard to predict. So you might as well take more of them to help get you to the finish line and really help get those spike weeks in there along the way.
If you play on Underdog, which is where Betz and I play a lot, you have to start 3 wide receivers every single week and a flex. So, you really do need 8 or 9 guys to be able to kind of sort that out. But there's a myth of the quote best ball wide receiver, and we say this a lot. And I've done this many times where we talk about a player and say, oh, he's better for best ball than he is for redraft. And what we usually mean is that's Deshaun Jackson. That's Will Fuller. That's a player that can have these huge spike games and then not do anything. You totally want spike weeks. Like those are great. But you also want someone that's going to be able to get you to weeks 14, 15, 16, or 17. If you're playing in something like Best Ball Mania, then that's where you're trying to get to. You're trying to finish, the season in a direction where you can actually, be in the championship. So Betz, I want to give you some examples of players from last year. And you tell me when I name this player, if they were good for fantasy. Just give me your gut reaction.
All right. Hit me.
Darius Slayton.
Not great.
If you were like me, you had Darius Slayton last year in a lot of best ball. And I really did, because he had 8 touchdowns his rookie year. Like he actually was great. Darius Slayton was the wide receiver 4 in week 1. Like he was awesome, but the rest of the season, Betz, he was the wide receiver 67.
Not great, Bob.
No, that's very bad. What about DJ Chark Jr.? And how did you feel about DJ Chark last year?
Oh, a lot of personal pain from playing him weekly in DFS, but I think he was a guy who entered with a lot of hype. We talked about him on the show. I think relative to his hype, he was a disappointment.
He was definitely a disappointment because he was one of those players the year before with Gardner Minshew where like he did have those spike weeks. He had 2 touchdown games, Betz, he had 2 weeks over 15 fantasy points. 2, and that's it. So he didn't actually provide you those spike weeks that you thought you were going to get from best ball. I'm going to give you one more. Christian Kirk. What do you remember about Christian Kirk last year?
I remember him just running a lot of routes, and that's it. Nothing else.
He had a 3 touchdown game, and that's basically it. He actually had 50% of his production bets in 3 games. Half of his entire production for the season came in 3 games. The rest of the year, he was worthless. And he was averaging like 4 or 5 points a game. So I give you those examples because I felt the pain of selecting those guys in best ball last year. And Darius Slayton, DJ Chark Jr., Christian Kirk were perceived best ball wide receivers. And yet you also need players that can give you consistent points. So there's players that you might see in your queue like Russell Gage or Sterling Shepard or Jarvis Landry that are perceived like those are slot guys. They're not really going to help you. Those are super helpful because while Darius Slayton might have given you 1 good week, he didn't show up at all in terms of the wide receiver win rates. And I think it's important to have your roster and have those guys. I mean, Russell Gage, Sterling Shepard, like those are wide receiver 5 and 6s, maybe even 7 on your roster. So you're not really having to give up much draft capital. What do you think in terms of the best ball wide receiver and then these kind of like safe guys?
Yeah, I think the way you talked about it, I think is perfect. Like, it's so funny because we get this every year and you hear other people talk about it. It's like, oh, this guy's like, I don't want him in redraft. I want him in best ball. And it's like, well, if you don't want him in redraft, why do you want him in best ball? Like, you want weekly points. I don't want Deshaun Jackson to come in for 2 games. Like, that doesn't, it helps a little. It doesn't help a lot. Like, and if those 2 games happen early in the season and then it just falls off and you don't even get to the finish line, like, what does it matter, right? So you basically need, I think, a good combination of ceiling and floor combined. What I mean by that is like, it's okay to have 1 or 2 of those guys on your roster, but don't think like, oh, I'm going into this draft and I'm taking quote unquote best ball wide receivers, because you're going to be really disappointed come end of the year. I remember last year we talked a lot about Jamison Crowder, right? Being like a huge value and perceived like, oh, like he's just meh. Like he's a wide receiver 3, 4. I'll pick him up, in the 10th or 11th round and be fine with it. Not excited. And like halfway through the year, he was like the wide receiver 4 or something like that. Like you just don't, you want to be relying on volume and opportunity just like you do in redraft, but understanding that in best ball, it's okay to take a swing for the fence every now and then on a player, but don't go into the mindset of like, I need quote unquote best ball wide receivers, because you're not going to do very well.
I'm finding myself having a mix of these players. So I've had a couple of rosters where Sterling Shepard's on the team and maybe Henry Ruggs is on the team. It's like, okay, I can kind of see the scenario where Ruggs hits a ceiling and then he like goes 2 for 14 the next week. But Sterling Shepard's like, okay, I can get 4 or 5 catches, and that's someone that I can actually depend on some points. You do not want a 0 in the wide receiver position. And so that's why Betz and I talked a lot about 8 or 9 guys is really what you want. But let's finish this positional talk and talk about tight ends, because just like the other onesie position quarterback bets, it's usually 2 or 3. You don't want any less. You don't want any more. My first question I want to start off, though, is kind of tricky. What happens if someone does miss out on Kelsey, Kittle, or Waller?
Well, you go back to last week's episode and you listen to our 2 favorite later round guys. No, I'm just kidding. But in all seriousness, take Anthony Firkser. What you do in reality is if you miss out on one of those top tier guys, we just know, like, look at the historical trends of tight end, right? Like, the guys in the middle are not good. Like, you don't want to be taking your tight end 1 in round 7 or 6. Like, those guys just don't actually get there. And the difference between the tight end 9 and the tight end like 14 is literally like single digit points sometimes on a year-to-year basis, depending on the year. So it makes a ton of sense to say, okay, I have 2 options. I go into my draft and I happen to take Kelsey, I happen to take Waller, I happen to take Kittle. You do not need another tight end. You do not even want another tight end. Don't even think about it until you get to at least the double-digit rounds. Because if you're taking 2 tight ends somewhat early or in the middle rounds, you're basically, again, wasting upside at the wide receiver position. It's just not worth it. But if you miss out on those guys, again, you don't want 2 guys, then you probably want 3, because you're making up for lack of quality with quantity, essentially, and just taking a couple dart throws later in your draft that you're saying, like, I know I'm not going to reach the ceiling of Darren Waller. Like, I just don't have that guy on my roster. So what I need to do is have more shots at 2 touchdown games. All of a sudden, Anthony Firkser's catching fire and he has a couple touchdowns in a row, a couple weeks in a row. Like, you need those types of situations to kind of fall out. So for me, it's either tight end early, pair him with a guy late, or go into it and saying, you know what, if I miss on those guys, it's fine. I'll just take 3 later in my draft.
I think this is where tier-based drafting comes really in handy, because when you look at the tiers last year, it was like Kelsey and Waller, and obviously Kittle was hurt, but the tight end 3 was Robert Tonyan, but he finished like 70-something points behind Waller. Like, it was a massive gap, even though Tonyan had like a huge TD season and no one really drafted him at all. But this is where you get to look at your tiers, because there's a massive difference between you investing in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th round at tight end and what you're passing up. Like, what you're passing up in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th round is running backs and wide receivers. You're passing up guys like Calvin Ridley last year. Like, that's the kind of thing. Would you rather have Mark Andrews last year or Calvin Ridley at the same draft position? Like, that's the difference of kind of like how teams were constructed. So yeah, Betz is right. If you get one of the elite guys, I think it's totally fine. I find myself, if Kelsey slips to the 2nd round, he's on my team. Kittle at the end of the 2nd, Waller at the end of the 2nd, early 3rd. Like, that's where I'm taking these guys, because then I only have to find one other dude. If it's my boy Firkser, I'm going to go at the end. If it's, somebody else at the end, I'm totally fine with that. But if you miss out on those guys, find someone that's kind of more like 9th, 10th round. We've mentioned Tyler Higbee as one of our favorites, and stack 3 of those guys. But any last thoughts on tight end?
No, I think you hit it perfectly.
So one thing last to mention before Betz and I get into a game is bye weeks. A lot of people obsess about bye weeks and they look at their players and they call it a tiebreaker. In my opinion, don't worry about bye weeks until you start getting later on till rounds like 8, 9, 10. Like, that can be a tiebreaker, but don't obsess over that. Like, it's totally okay. Get the best players no matter what. And next week, we're going to be talking exclusively about stacking, which is something strategy-wise is super important. So next week is a whole episode devoted to stacking. But Betz, I'm really interested in this next segment because
I want to play. the game.
So, Betz, are you a little intimidated by this game?
I hate that drop. It gets me every time, man. I'm terrified right now.
You know, I construct these games. Betz and I don't play every single episode, but when I do, I usually will message him and say, hey, dude, by the way, we're playing a game this week. And he has no idea. You have no idea what's coming, do you?
And then my heart rate just jumps to the roof. My watch asks me, are you okay? And I say, no, Kyle is planning to torture me tonight. So I have no idea what's coming.
Guys, if you're listening to this episode and this is how Betz perishes, one, thanks for being in on this communal experience, but we'll get to speak at your funeral. I've already prepared a eulogy. So this game, Betz, is we're going to be talking about win rates. And that might be a concept for a lot of you guys that's maybe different, but win rates is basically asking how often this player ended up on a winning best ball roster. And we can only do that by looking back at last year. So Betz, I'm going to go through some of the positional win rates for best ball. And here's what I want you to do, Betz. I want you to just get in the mindset of who was good last year. Okay? Like who was good for fantasy? Because I think that's really the easiest way to think about win rates. But on a player basis, anything above 10% for a player is really good for win rate. 20% is excellent. Okay? But win rates are based on not just, did they end up on the winning roster, but what do they cost you? So for instance, last year, CMC Betz, what happened to your best ball roster if you likely drafted CMC at the 101?
You probably wasted a lot of effort, a lot of energy, and money because he did not play that much last year and you took him first overall.
Isn't that crazy to think we had no idea at the time? And I'm sure I had some drafts where I took CMC at the 101, but that draft was done. It was done already. And I put in. As soon
as you click the draft button, it was done.
You're like, I'm going to take the best player in fantasy. This guy is actually 2 players in 1, and it didn't matter. So, because if you're taking someone like CMC at the 101, you're also thinking, what am I passing up? And you can only do this in hindsight. So please realize what we're talking about now is not second guessing whether you should take the CMC. I would take him at the 101 this year. I actually did in a recent draft, but it's something, Betz, that I want to talk about. I don't know if you're familiar with. It's the Eno Benjamin principle.
Please explain.
Okay, so Eno Benjamin last year for running backs, Betz. Do you remember anything about his season?
I remember him coming out of college. And people were hyped about Eno Benjamin because he had I don't know if this is right. He had a 6 touchdown game or something stupid in college. And everyone was just bought into him. And the whole time I was like, man, this guy seems like just a dude. I don't think he's going to be that good in the NFL. And then I believe he did not have any relevance in the NFL to this point. I don't remember starting him in fantasy, so that's all that matters to me.
You were spot on. So he was a 7th round draft pick last year. He accumulated as many points as my dead grandmother. Rest in peace.
Oh my God.
I know, that's dark.
Oh my God.
Benjamin Betz scored 0 fantasy points. But let me say this, Betz. Okay? Benjamin ranked 20th in a running back win rate last year.
How does that even work?
So the reason why that works, Betz, is because where you were taking Benjamin was usually with your last pick of your draft. And I know that when you were thinking about this best ball strategy, you did not think my grandmother or Benjamin would come into play. But audience, here's really what the thought behind it is. CMC costed you the 101. Benjamin likely costed you the 1812, the last pick of your draft. And so he could actually show up on more winning rosters because he didn't cost you as much. And so that's what we need to think about with win rates is we need to think about it in terms of what round did this player get drafted in. So at the very bottom with win rates last year were CMC and Saquon because they're injuries. But actually Ezekiel Elliott was pretty far down there as well because he cost you the 103, 104, somewhere around there. And it actually hurt your team because of what you were passing up, which is, maybe Dalvin Cook or someone else. So with win rates, we need to think about opportunity cost and when they were drafted. And last thing I'll say before we get into trivia bets is it matters what round you draft a player in. So Travis Kelce, if you drafted him in the 1st round last year, Betz, if you got frisky, you were just feeling like, okay, I think I want to be different. Travis Kelce's win rate in the 1st round last year was 0.5%. It was bad. But if you
Oof.
drafted him in the second round, it was the highest of all tight ends. It was 27.5. So there's a massive difference, and we need to think about ADP. And have you felt that way in drafts? Like when you're drafting, like, okay, am I getting this player at an ADP that matters? Or is this just like, I'm forcing it? I'm actually overdrafting. Like, have you thought about that a lot in your drafts?
Yeah, for sure. We talked about it actually. One example that comes to mind is that Bengals team I had from a couple of weeks ago where, you know, like at the time, no one was really buying into the Bengals potentially having a good offense. I think they could be good this year. And there was so much value. So like I like the value-based drafting approach, but also understanding that like at some point in this wide summer of drafting that we're going to do, like you miss out on guys because their ADP gets ridiculous. Like I love the idea of Travis Kelce on my roster. I'm not sure I'm taking him at like 5th or 6th overall, which is currently his Underdog ADP. I found myself with 0 shares of him on their site because of that. So yeah, I think looking at like, you know, comparing ADPs across different best ball platforms, understanding ADP and understanding where it's sort of just like groupthink and like everyone goes towards it, but still understanding that there's value elsewhere, I think is really a good way to do it. And I'm with you. I think that makes a ton of sense to like really think about, you know, am I reaching for a player just because I want him, or does the ADP make sense? I think it's okay to reach every now and then, not too much, because it's been shown that if you go more than one round in reaching, it's actually a negative EV type of move. But if you are able to kind of stay in that range, like it's way better than actually risking it. So yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. ADP is super important in best ball.
Yeah, and obviously with ADP, we're guessing what we think is best, and overall, like the community's pretty good at establishing this Underdog, and DraftKings is good at establishing ADP. But we do need to keep that in mind that, you know, you could say, like, oh, I want this player, I'm going to be different than everyone else. But it's like, hey, you got Chris Carson in the 2nd round, everyone else got him in the 4th round. That doesn't actually help your team. It's actually putting you behind. So, Betz, I have a couple of trivia questions. If you're listening at home, on the toilet, whatever you're doing, I'm going to give you a couple of questions, and I want you to think to yourself, who was good last year in 2020? Like, who was it that was helpful? So, Betz, first question for you. Can you name for me the only 3 first-round running backs that finished in top 12 of running back win rate? So, there were lots of running backs drafted in the first round last year. Obviously, CMC and Saquon were not in that group. So name those 3 running backs.
All right. I'm going to go with King Henry.
The snow model man himself.
That's right. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. Dalvin Cook.
Yes.
And for number 3, Alvin Kamara.
Betz, you are starting off splendidly. Yes, Alvin Kamara was number 1. He was drafted at 105. Number 2 in win rate was Dalvin Cook at 106. And number 3 was Derrick Henry at 108. So if you somehow were gifted with draft picks in that range and you avoided, like if you didn't have the first or second pick last year, Betz, it was a good thing. Like it's kind of,
I was going to say you probably did all right.
That's what's crazy about last year is if you said to yourself, all right, I'm not picking CMC, I'm not picking Saquon, and I'm not picking Michael Thomas, you did okay.
Crazy.
That's wild. The top 2 running backs and the best wide receiver in fantasy, you had to avoid them last year. So, all right, question number 2. Can you name to me 2 of the late round running backs, so rounds 12 plus, that were among the top 12 running back win percentage in 2020? So who are the late round guys last year that ended up like helping people win best ball?
The most obvious answer, this feels like a layup. It's got to be James Robinson, right? No one wanted him. He was probably taken in like the 16th, 17th, 18th round of drafts. So he ended up being an RB1. James Robinson. I assume that's correct.
That is not correct. Keep going.
Oh, is it really not correct? Who the heck was it? All right, hold on. Let me give you my second one. I'm going to go with Mike. I don't skip leg day. Davis. That's my second answer.
So those are both really good guesses because they were late round guys. And when we think about redraft, like those were the 2 dudes that you picked up either on the waiver wire, but they're actually guys that helped you not only get to the fantasy championship, but they helped you in weeks 14, 15, and 16. And so that's where James Robinson fell short. It's the only reason he fell a little short is because remember he was injured those last couple of weeks.
Yep.
So those guys, in terms of rounds 12 plus that were in the top 12 win rate, were number 5, Nyheim Hines, number 7, Chase Edmonds in the 12th round, and number 8, Mike's boy, Antonio Gibson, went in the 14th round for a lot of the summer. That's crazy to think about now because he's basically a second round guy this year. So
that's wild. Also, I'm just realizing on the show doc, you have it where the background of it is cleared or covered, so I can't actually see the words, but you can just highlight it and it shows the answer. What the heck am I doing? I should be cheating on this one.
I stole that off of Brooks's playbook. Yes, it's actually here right in front of you, Betz, but you had no idea that I was tricking you. So a couple more questions. Number 3, which wide receivers ended up on the most winning rosters last year? So for Best Ball, who are the wide receivers that people said they helped me win a Best Ball championship?
I'm just realizing I read the doc and I wrote down an answer that correlates to who I think will help this year. So hold on, let me think of an answer really quick. Spoiler, I wrote down Calvin Ridley and Amari Cooper, who I do not think are the correct answers to this question. Clearly, Amari Cooper fell off without Dak. I think Calvin Ridley actually still is a pretty good answer. I'm going to go with Calvin Ridley.
Calvin Ridley was definitely on that list.
Okay, yeah. He was like a 4th round ADP, ended up being, a top, 6-7 guy. So that makes a ton of sense. And I remember down the stretch, too, he had a couple of games that were huge against like Tampa and a couple other teams.
And he's a Falcon.
So we love the Falcons. Let's see. Who other wide receivers end up with the most winning rosters? I can't think after Calvin Ridley. You're going to have to hit me with the answers.
All right. So when it comes to wide receivers, it's the late round guys that kind of showed out that were on a lot of rosters. And then it's just the guys that outpaced everyone else. So for last year, Stephon Diggs was on the most rosters because he was drafted almost in the 6th round. Is that not crazy to think about? We all thought, man, he's going to Buffalo. It's going to be bad. Devontae Adams, Justin Jefferson was a huge win rate guy who was 3rd overall. Brendan Ayuk, your boy, in the 15th round. Calvin Ridley was 5th. Tyreek Hill was 6th. And then in the 18th round, Betz, Corey Davis would have been someone you would have taken with your very last pick last year that ended up being 7th in win rate. So any takeaways from that list?
Yeah, I feel like an idiot. That's the takeaway. Clearly, these are all like the top options in fantasy, and I couldn't even think of them. But the other thing that sticks out is like there's not a lot of like surprises here, right? Like this makes sense. Devontae Adams, Calvin Ridley, Tyreek Hill, Diggs. Like it makes sense because these guys not only got there like most weeks, but they also have just so much upside, and that's kind of what we're talking about with these like combo wide receivers that not only have a great ceiling but also just have floor to help get you there. It's these guys that are reliable most weeks. So that makes a ton of sense. And I think we should employ that strategy in our drafts.
And we're looking back in hindsight. So realize we can look at these and go like, oh, well, if you just didn't draft Michael Thomas last year, or if you didn't go for Julio Jones, no, what you're looking at is a combination of opportunity cost and just a crazy season like Devontae Adams had. So, all right, 2 more bets. I think you're going to do a little bit better on this one. Which quarterbacks had the highest win rates from around 7 to 15? So none of the early guys, so you can't pick Mahomes. And spoiler alert, Lamar Jackson was not even close to being in the top 12 win rate. He was actually detrimental to your team. But who are the quarterbacks with the highest win rates last year?
All right, I'm going to go with Ryan Smash the Over Tannehill, because every week on the DFS show, we talk about him. Their games are high scoring. They always hit the over. So I'm going Ryan Tannehill because he was a late round guy. And then I'm going to go with Tom Brady. He also was like a mid to late round guy. Yes, Thomas Edward Patrick Brady. Perhaps you've heard of him. He's won a Super Bowl or 2.
He wasn't drafted. He wasn't drafted to be great. I can tell you that. Based on his draft.
No, he was not. He was drafted to just sit on the bench and hold a clipboard.
All right. So yeah, you got one of those. It was Brady. So Josh Allen last year was going in the 8th round. He was the number 1 quarterback win rate. Yeah, I know. Isn't that crazy?
That's nuts. I pictured him as like a 5th round guy.
Aaron Rodgers last year was going in the 10th round. So you can
no one wanted him.
Deshaun Watson, or the artist formerly known as Deshaun Watson, and Russell Wilson were both taken at the back of the 7th. They were tied for 3rd, and then 4th was your boy Tom Brady. So my point in pointing out these guys is when you think of that list right there, you think of Josh Allen as like dude, he finishes the quarterback one. Aaron Rodgers, he had an MVP season. Deshaun Watson led the league in passing yards. Tom Brady was awesome down the stretch. Like, you can find these quarterbacks later on that give you the win rates that you need. Just make sure you stack them, which is what we're going to talk about next week. Like, the best part about Brady is if instead of stacking with Godwin last year, you stacked with Evans, like you had a pretty solid team. Or even if you went with Gronk, who started out slow, that was total fine. But all right, so you did pretty good bets, I will say, on recapping 2020. But let's give one question for the people, because I know you're a man of the people. Give me a player outside of the top 15 rounds right now that you think can be a win rate guy in 2021. So these are like guys that you're just shooting your shot. You know, you're doing your Michael Scott, throw it over the shoulder, 30 different takes. Maybe you'll hit one of them. Give me some guys in the later rounds that you think can actually be beneficial.
All right. I'm gonna go with the quarterback. I have a couple names listed here. I'm gonna go with the quarterback who I think is like the perfect quarterback 3 to take. We talked about rushing upside being massive when you're talking about taking a second quarterback to kind of fill a ceiling approach here, because you know your first guy is going to score most weeks more than this player. That is Taysom Hill. And say what you want about Taysom Hill. Is he a quarterback? Is he a tight end? Is he a running back? No one knows, but all that matters is when Sean Payton plays him at quarterback, this dude puts up fantasy points. Last year, he started 5 games in a row from weeks 10 to 14 for this team. Wasn't great in week 10. However, in week 11, 12, 13, 14, here are his finishes. Quarterback 4, quarterback 11, quarterback 8, quarterback 11. Why? Because he was running the football. That's what he's going to do. If he gets the starting gig, you're telling me he gets like, let's say 12, 13, 14 starts at quarterback. I mean, he is going to finish inside the top 12 of the position just because of running the football. So to me, if I'm taking someone late and I'm just punting off my third quarterback or my second, Taysom Hill is risky, and I wouldn't do this in like just a regular 12-man league. This is more of like a huge tournament, like underdog type of play. But no one wants Taysom Hill, and the best part about him is that you don't even need to stack the Saints because he's not going to throw the football a ton. He's going to rush if he gets a starting gig. It's risky. We don't know if he's starting. We don't know if it's Jameis, but I just think there's a lot of outs here because the ADP is so low that it doesn't matter. Like, he's literally going in the last round of drafts that, for me, Taysom Hill has so much upside, despite the fact that I feel like there's just this like negative connotation with his name. So to me, Taysom Hill, a great late round target this year.
So you're telling me you can play Taysom naked?
You can do it. You could be naked. He could be naked. There could be a lot of things happening. Taysom Hill, though, could be making you win a lot of money this year.
In case you're a first-time listener and you're asking yourself, where did that come from? In DFS, we refer to playing a quarterback without stacking them as playing them naked, all by themselves, alone. So yes, you can play a running quarterback like that, like Taysom Hill. I'm going to give you a guy, Betz, and you just tell me if I'm crazy. Actually, you know what? I'm going to ask you a question. All right. Who is the Lions wide receiver 1 right now?
We don't know.
We don't know. And right now, there is a player that's not really being drafted that I think could actually give your roster a different construction. And that's my boy, Quintez Cephus. Yes, he was in the league last year, drafted out of Wisconsin. He actually had a pretty good production profile at Wisconsin, some good athletic measurables. And so right now, everyone's going to be chasing him on Ross St. Brown, the sun god, our boy Tyrell Williams, Rashad Perryman. I don't know if any of those guys are actually the wide receiver 1. Quintez Cephus at least has been on the team longer than these other people. Like, I can at least say that for sure. And I know they brought in these other guys. So Quintez Cephus is my dart throw, round 18 wide receiver at the very end of my bench. Could be a nothing. He also could be the Lions wide receiver 1.
I like it. If you're listening at home and you say, you guys sound like crazy people, that's because if these were actually good plays, you would be taking them 10 rounds a bunch. So we're not trying to like put your, bet the house on this. But I think that these guys have a path to opportunity. And like you said, this is how you get different. This is how you win with high upside but low risk late in your draft. So I think Cephus is actually a really sneaky play because the Lions just have this like gross taste in your mouth type of team, like Dan Campbell bite your kneecaps off type of feels. But what if Jared Goff is actually good? I mean, what if? And Quintez Cephus comes out with like 800 yards and 8 touchdowns. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but holy crap, if it did in the 18th round, that would be sweet in best ball.
Yeah, and that's really all we're looking for. Like I mentioned Corey Davis earlier. He was an 18th round pick last year. Maybe Corey Davis, obviously a little different in terms of draft capital, but you're looking for players at the end of your draft that you think can be difference makers. And Betz and I are going to be talking about that in a couple of weeks. Like we're going to be talking about tournament winners. And I think that's going to be a fun episode because we're not just going to be talking about the Quintus Cephas's of the world. We're going to talk about players at their ADP that we think can have spike weeks. But I did want to mention this, that Betz and I are going to start posting on social media. So if you're not following us on Twitter, I don't know what you're doing. You should stay logged on. Betz is at the Fantasy PT. I'm at Kyle_Borg. We're going to start posting bets or best balls from Underdog on social media. So you can play with us. Some of them will be 30 seconds. If Betz, has a couple, extra time on the back porch or something. I'm more of an 8-hour slow draft guy with kids.
You're so old, dude. You're so old.
Dude, it's really hard for me to say, all right, 30 minutes, let's go. But maybe a late night. But follow us on social media. We are going to be posting some of those best balls. I'm excited about that, Betz, because I want to play with the people. Like I want to be where the people are, aerial
Me too,
style.
man.
Yeah,
absolutely. And if you think any of the advice that we just gave on the show is real, just kidding. This is all a lie. We're doing the exact opposite. We're going to take your money.
That is such great things. Like I've played with ballers like Andy, Mike, and Jason in leagues, and what they say on the show, I tested in the leagues, and I'm like, oh, okay, are you really going to play this out? And so you can actually hear all of our advice, see if we're going to be actually drafting Quintus Cephas or anyone else. So yes, play with us. We'd love to play. It's the summer of best ball. This is why we're here, Betz. So any closing, final, deep quotes, any Dolly Parton thoughts?
Oh, no Dolly Parton thoughts. However, one quick thought, real quick. You got to tune in next week. Make sure you're subscribed. Stacking is the key in best ball. We'll talk all about it next week. We'll see you guys then.
Can't wait to talk to you guys. See you next week.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Fantasy Footballers DFS Podcast. Don't forget to visit us on the web at www.thefantasyfootballers.com.